In the year 701, within the glittering yet merciless Tang court, a 17-year-old princess was condemned without trial, without defense. Her name was Yongtai, granddaughter of Wu Zetian, the only empress to ever rule China. Forced into silence, buried alive, her youth was crushed beneath the weight of suspicion and power. Her death became the quiet testimony of how absolute rule devours its own blood. The story of Princess Yongtai begins not in darkness, but in light. Born in the year 685, she was the daughter of Crown Prince Zhongmu and the granddaughter of Emperor Gaozong of Tang. From the very moment of her birth, her life was woven into the grand tapestry of one of China's most dazzling dynasties. The Tang court in Chang'an was a place of intoxicating splendor. Its palaces stretching like labyrinths of jade and gold, its gardens filled with peonies, willows, and nightingales, its halls echoing with poetry and song. Yongtai grew up in a world where beauty and refinement were expected as much as loyalty and obedience. As a young girl, she was surrounded by tutors who taught her the Confucian classics, but also by musicians who guided her fingers across zithers and flutes, and by poets who nurtured her ability to weave words into delicate verses. She absorbed not only the etiquette of a Tang princess, but also the artistic soul of her age. Accounts of her youth praise her for both intelligence and elegance, qualities that made her stand out in a court already filled with refinement. Yet within the glitter, danger lurked. The Tang dynasty was radiant on the surface, but beneath its silk draperies ran currents of intrigue sharp as daggers. Court life demanded that every smile be measured, every phrase weighed. A misplaced word could mean the difference between favor and disgrace. A single rumor could shape the course of a family's future. For Yongtai, her very brilliance became both her gift and her peril. In a palace where eyes constantly measured worth, her presence shone too brightly, drawing attention that would one day prove fatal. She was also bound by blood to figures who stood precariously in the shifting balance of power. Her father, once heir apparent, lived under the suffocating shadow of suspicion from his formidable stepmother, Empress Wu Zetian. Her grandmother by blood, but her ruler by fate, Wu Zetian was a woman whose ambition outstripped precedent, whose hands never hesitated to sever ties if they threatened her climb to supremacy. For a girl like Yongtai, even kinship could not guarantee safety. It could just as easily become a chain. Still, during those fleeting years of her youth, she lived the life of a princess. Banquets in the palace glittered with silver platters of delicacies. Roasted pheasants, sweet lotus cakes, steaming bowls of rice perfumed with spices brought along the silk road. Musicians played as dancers twirled in flowing sleeves, creating whirlwinds of silk that mimicked blossoms in spring. Amid this beauty, Yongtai might have allowed herself to dream of marriage, of children, of a future where her wit and charm would earn her not suspicion, but admiration. But history would not allow such innocence to endure. Every dynasty, no matter how radiant, casts shadows. And the Tang court was a place where youth and joy could be extinguished in a heartbeat by whispers in the wrong ear. Yongtai's life, though adorned with poetry, jewels, and laughter, was already tethered to the machinery of suspicion that grinded relentlessly around her family. Her beauty was praised, her talents admired, yet in the cold arithmetic of politics, they became marks against her. A princess of the Tang was never truly free. Every gesture was political, every alliance scrutinized. For Yongtai, the palace was both sanctuary and prison, a gilded cage with walls of jade. She may have laughed with her cousins, written poems on silk, or gazed out at the lantern-lit city of Chang'an, but beneath it all lay the truth. she was never simply a girl of 17. She was blood of the throne, and that meant her fate would not be her own. Her story, like so many of the Tang court, would move from brilliance to silence. The seeds of tragedy had already been sown. To understand the fate of Princess Yongtai, one must first step into the world shaped by her grandmother, Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as emperor. Wu was not merely a powerful consort or regent. She was an architect of destiny who bent the Tang dynasty to her will and carved her name into history with both brilliance and brutality. By the time Yongtai was a child, Wu Zetian had already maneuvered herself into a position unlike any woman before her. She had been a concubine to Emperor Taizong, later wife to Emperor Gaozong, and ultimately the supreme power behind the throne. After Gaozong's death, she removed rivals one by one, sons, daughters, ministers, until in 690 she proclaimed herself Emperor of China, founding the Zhou dynasty and ruling in her own right. For the court, this was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. On one hand, Wu's reign brought remarkable achievements. She promoted capable officials regardless of birth, encouraged Buddhism as a counterweight to Confucian conservatism, and presided over a period of prosperity and expansion. Chang'an thrived as a global capital, drawing merchants, scholars, and diplomats from Persia, India, and beyond. The empire glittered under her iron hand. But power has its price, and Wu demanded absolute loyalty. Any hint of dissent, any shadow of disloyalty, was met with merciless retribution. Ministers accused of treason were executed, sometimes along with their families. Princes and princesses who stood in her path often met quiet, unexplained deaths. The palace became a theater of fear where whispers traveled faster than truth, and no one, neither courtier nor kin, was beyond suspicion. It was in this atmosphere that Yongtai came of age. Imagine being a teenager surrounded by such tension, laughter at court masking terror, poets reciting verses while guards carried away the accused. Even family bonds provided no refuge, for Wu's suspicion extended even to her own bloodline. She had deposed her own sons when they threatened her grip on the throne. She had elevated and destroyed relatives in quick succession, reshaping alliances as ruthlessly as she shifted policies. Yongtai, as a granddaughter, lived both close to the throne and dangerously within its reach. She was adored for her intelligence and beauty. But in Wu's eyes, admiration could transform overnight into threat. To shine too brightly was to risk being seen as a rival. To remain too quiet was to be forgotten. The delicate balance between obedience and visibility was impossible to maintain. For the Tang dynasty under Wu, politics was no longer just about armies and decrees. It was about survival within the palace walls. Courtiers scribbled poetry by day and plotted by night. Eunuchs whispered secrets into the empress's ear, deciding fates with a sentence. Ministers navigated the treacherous waters of flattery and betrayal, knowing that one misstep could mean exile or execution. For Yongtai, this world was no abstract game of power. It was the air she breathed, the ground she walked upon. Each time she bowed to her grandmother, each time she recited words of loyalty, she must have felt the unspoken question. Was it enough? Could any gesture truly assure safety under Wu's watchful eyes? In such an empire, even innocence could be construed as rebellion. The mere existence of youth and charm, combined with a dangerous lineage, could summon suspicion. Wu Zetian had risen to power by severing bonds and silencing threats. For Yongtai, being a beloved granddaughter was no shield, it was a liability. And so, in the shadow of the only female emperor in China's history, the fate of Princess Yongtai was being quietly written. A dynasty flourishing on the outside was rotting within, and the empress who ruled with unmatched brilliance also sowed fear that would devour her own kin. Whispers are the deadliest weapons in a palace. They glide across silk curtains, slip beneath gilded doors, and seep into the mind of a ruler already steeped in suspicion. For Princess Yongtai, it was not a sword nor a battlefield that doomed her, but the intangible shadow of rumor. The chronicles tell us that Yongtai, along with her cousin Princess Anlei and the crown prince, was accused of plotting rebellion. To the modern ear, the charge sounds absurd. How could a 17-year-old girl pose any serious threat to the throne? But within Wu Zetian's court, innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was perception, and perception was shaped by words whispered in fear or ambition. Some historians argue that the charges were little more than a pretext. Yongtai's father had once stood as heir apparent, and though he had been stripped of his position, his children remained dangerous symbols. The mere possibility that loyalty might gather around them was enough to warrant their destruction. For an emperor like Wu Zetian, absolute power required not just ruling the present, but annihilating all potential futures that might undermine her. Others suggest that the accusations were sparked by jealousy and rivalry. Yongtai, admired for her beauty and refinement, had drawn the attention of poets and courtiers. Her cousin, Princess Anlei, was notorious for her ambition, even urging her mother, Wu Zetian, to displace the legitimate heir so that she might rule. In such a charged atmosphere, even small gestures, an overheard conversation, a private laugh, a shared glance, could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Imagine the dread that must have spread when the accusations surfaced. Within the palace, everyone understood the consequences of such charges. Ministers had been executed for far less. Princes had been deposed on mere suspicion. For a teenage princess, the weight of the empire's fear now pressed upon her shoulders, heavy as stone. What would she have thought in those final days of accusation? Did she plead her innocence, whispering through tears to those closest to her? Did she try to cling to the memory of laughter with her cousins, of poetry recited under lantern light, of music drifting through the palace halls? Or did she know, deep within her, that once suspicion had been spoken aloud, her fate was already sealed? The tragedy lies not only in her death, but in the cruel inevitability of it. In a court ruled by fear, rumor became verdict, suspicion became sentence. Yongtai was not given the dignity of trial, nor the mercy of explanation. She was simply redefined, from cherished granddaughter to dangerous traitor, from jewel of the dynasty to threat against its survival. Such is the nature of power when it becomes absolute. It requires enemies to justify its vigilance. It invents conspiracies to validate its cruelty. And in that world, the bright promise of a young princess was transfigured into a shadowy plot, not because she conspired, but because the empress needed her to. Thus, the fate of Yongtai began to darken. Whispers turned into proclamations, and the girl who had once been surrounded by music and poetry now found herself standing on the edge of silence, staring into the abyss her grandmother's suspicion had opened beneath her. In an empire where justice was shaped by power, the sentence arrived with chilling speed. There was no court assembly, no gathering of ministers, no solemn debate over evidence. The decision came down as though carved in stone. Princess Yongtai must die. The brutality lay not only in the act itself, but in its cold efficiency. At 17, her life had hardly begun. Yet, in the eyes of the empress, It had already lasted too long. Wu Zetian, accustomed to pruning her family tree as one prunes a garden, saw in Yongtai not a granddaughter, but a branch that might one day cast an unwanted shadow. There is no record of a defense, no account of her voice rising in protest. The Tang chronicles offer only silence, a silence that mirrors the suffocation imposed upon her. Perhaps she was told her fate in a dim chamber where courtiers avoided her eyes. Perhaps eunuchs delivered the decree in whispers, their faces unreadable, their loyalty bound not to compassion, but to survival. What did it mean for a teenage girl to confront such a decree? 17 is the age of first loves, of dreams sketched on paper, of laughter with friends echoing late into the night. For Yongtai, it became the age of finality, a closing of the curtain before the play had even begun. She had been raised in palaces gilded with dragons and phoenixes, but now those same walls turned into her prison, closing around her with merciless indifference. One cannot help but imagine the emotional theater of that moment. Did she plead with her grandmother, recalling tender moments of childhood, hoping the memory of shared blood might soften the Empress's resolve? Did she cry out in disbelief, her voice swallowed by the endless corridors of the palace? Or did she fall into resigned silence, knowing that in this court, resistance was as futile as breath against stone? The injustice was compounded by the secrecy of it all. Public trials, however cruel, at least acknowledged the existence of the accused. Yongtai was not granted even that. Her sentence was delivered in shadows, her death arranged behind veils of silence. By removing her quietly, Wu Zetian denied her not only life, but memory. The act of erasure was as deliberate as the act of execution. This was not a killing for justice. It was a killing for control. Wu Zetian's rule thrived on demonstration. Each act of suppression served as a warning. By extinguishing Yongtai, the Empress signaled to the court and to her family alike that no one was beyond her reach. Blood ties were meaningless, innocence irrelevant. Power recognized only itself. And so the fate of a teenage princess was sealed without a fight, without a word, without a moment of mercy. The cruelty was not in the spectacle of violence, but in the quiet certainty of it. The way her death slipped into the machinery of politics as though it were nothing more than a bureaucratic act. Princess Yongtai's story thus moves from rumor to decree, from whispered accusation to silenced verdict. At 17, she became both victim and symbol. A young life ended not by crime, but by the suffocating need of absolute rule to silence all that it could not control. Among all forms of execution, burial alive remains one of the most chilling. It is death not by steel, not by fire, but by silence. Soil pressing down upon lungs that cry out for air. For Princess Yongtai, legend and record intertwine to tell us that this was her fate: to be lowered into the earth before her time, to die not as a princess adorned in ceremony, but as a body swallowed by the ground. Accounts differ on the details, but the essence is unshakable. She was 17, accused of plotting treason, and the decree demanded her death without spectacle. To bury her alive was not just to kill her, it was to erase her voice completely, to make sure no cry, no last words, no testimony could disturb the silence of power. Picture the scene. A shallow pit dug hastily, perhaps within the palace grounds, away from public eyes. Eunuchs, bound by duty, carrying her under orders too absolute to question. The weight of earth piled upon her small frame, each shovelful dull as a drumbeat of finality. No crowd watched, no officials recorded. Only the indifferent sky bore witness as her last breath was smothered beneath the soil. there is a peculiar cruelty in this form of death. Unlike a swift execution, burial alive is slow, suffocating, intimate. The victim feels life slipping away grain by grain, the crushing heaviness of the world above pressing into chest and throat. For Yongtai, whose life had been surrounded by music and poetry, her last sounds were muffled gasps fading into silence. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overlooked. By ordering her buried alive, the regime ensured she was not only silenced in life, but also dishonored in death. A princess of the Tang should have been given processions of silk banners, rituals of incense, and ancestral rites sung by court musicians. Instead, she was denied ceremony, denied dignity, and transformed into a nameless casualty of power. Her death reverberated as both warning and terror. In the Tang court, no one could ignore what it meant. Even a granddaughter of the Empress was not safe from suspicion. If Yongtai could be buried alive, so could anyone. It was a message written not in ink, but in silence, buried with her beneath the earth. What is most haunting is how youth itself became a threat. At 17, she was at the cusp of life, a girl who should have been dreaming of marriage, of songs, of gardens in bloom. Instead, she became soil too soon, her laughter extinguished before it could echo into adulthood. Her burial became a metaphor for what fear does to a dynasty. It buries its own future alive. Thus, the story of Yongtai moved into its darkest chapter. Her body may have been hidden in the ground, but her death cast a shadow above it, an invisible shroud that cloaked the Tang palace in dread. The silence of her burial would speak louder than any words she could have uttered. The death of Princess Yongtai did not echo with public lamentations, yet its impact inside the Tang imperial family was devastating. Her burial alive sent ripples of fear through the corridors of the palace, silencing even those who might have dared to mourn. If a young girl of 17 could be condemned without trial, then what hope was there for anyone else whose loyalty might be questioned tomorrow? The court became an arena of whispered dread. Yongtai's brothers, cousins, and uncles kept their heads lowered, their voices hushed. Mothers dared not cry too loudly for daughters. Fathers dared not protest, lest they too be accused of harboring disloyalty. Grief became a private affair, locked behind chamber doors, for public sorrow could be read as subtle defiance. Her death underscored a bitter truth. Within Wu Zetian's reign, the family itself was not sacred. Kinship offered no sanctuary. Blood ties carried no guarantee of protection. On the contrary, they could become liabilities. A princess, once celebrated as a jewel of the dynasty, was now a ghost that haunted her relatives. Not because they did not love her, but because to remember her openly was to risk joining her in the grave. For the young women of the palace, the lesson was particularly stark. They were reminded that beauty, wit, or talent, qualities once thought to secure admiration, could as easily summon suspicion. If Yongtai's charm had made her beloved, it had also painted her as a threat. The message was cruel but clear. In a court ruled by fear, it was safer to be invisible than radiant. Even for Wu Zetian's surviving children, the execution of Yongtai must have struck terror into their hearts. The Empress had already deposed sons and punished daughters. Now her granddaughter had fallen. Who, then, could claim to be untouchable? Each day became a cautious performance of loyalty, every bow deeper, every phrase more carefully measured. Survival depended not on virtue, but on the ability to efface oneself before the Empress's gaze. Imagine the suffocating weight of such a household. The Tang Palace, once adorned with poetry and splendor, became a place where silence screamed louder than song. Eunuchs moved quickly through corridors, their eyes downcast, their hands carrying decrees that might end lives at a stroke. Concubines and princesses walked as though on glass, knowing one misstep could shatter their fragile security. The cruelty of Yongtai's death lay not only in her own suffering, but in the atmosphere it created for those who remained. It transformed the palace into a mausoleum of the living. Its inhabitants breathing, but in fear, adorned in silk, but shackled in silence. Each relative, each courtier, bore the invisible chains of suspicion, knowing that their fates could be rewritten at any time with the stroke of a brush. For the Tang imperial family, Yongtai's burial alive was not just an execution. It was a demonstration, a message carved into the psyche of every blood relative. Loyalty was never assumed, only tested, and failure meant annihilation. Her absence at the family banquets, her empty seat in the women's quarters, her name erased from conversations. All of these became daily reminders that in Wu Zetian's court, love was conditional, and power devoured even its own descendants. In the silence that followed her death, the dynasty trembled. The laughter of its youth had been smothered, replaced by an unending hush of fear. And in that silence, the tragedy of Princess Yongtai grew larger, casting its long shadow not only over her family, but over the entire empire. After her suffocating death, Princess Yongtai's burial was not one of honor, but of erasure. A princess of the Tang dynasty should have been granted ceremonies rich with incense, silk banners, and lines of mourners. Instead, her body was hurried into the ground with little dignity, her name left unspoken in the imperial court. The act was deliberate. To deny her a proper burial was to deny her memory. For a royal woman, posthumous honor mattered as much as life itself. It tied the dead to the continuity of the dynasty, ensured that their spirits rested peacefully, and gave legitimacy to the reign of their descendants. Stripping Yongtai of these rituals turned her into a ghost, both literally and politically. An unacknowledged life, buried not only in soil, but in silence. Her grave, at first, was simple and stark, stripped of the majesty befitting her bloodline. There were no lavish offerings of bronze mirrors or jade ornaments. No elaborate inscriptions carved her name into history. Instead, her final resting place was meant to disappear into obscurity. Like a pebble thrown into the river of time, its ripples quickly swallowed. For her family, this was a wound that could not be spoken of. To lament openly was to challenge Wu Zetian's judgment. To decorate her grave would risk drawing suspicion. So Yongtai's relatives were forced into a cruel paradox. They loved her, but they could not honor her. They remembered her, but only in secret. Every ancestor's rite that skipped her name became another act of enforced silence. This forgetting was more painful than death itself. For in the culture of Tang China, the grave was not just a hole in the earth. It was a bridge between the living and the dead. It was the place where memory endured, where family ties continued beyond life. To rob a person of their proper tomb was to cut the thread of their existence, condemning them to float unanchored in the afterlife. Imagine the shadows in the palace after her burial. Her former chambers, perhaps still filled with poems she had written or instruments she had played, became empty spaces no one dared to mention. Servants avoided speaking her name. Courtiers acted as though she had never existed. Even laughter among her cousins must have felt weighted with guilt. A fragile attempt to banish the memory of the cousin who had vanished into earth too soon. And yet, memory resists erasure. Stories of her fate traveled quietly, carried by whispers from eunuchs, by murmurs among palace women, by fragments scribbled in hidden records. Though the official court sought to silence her, her tragedy could not be completely buried. The injustice of a young princess suffocated and forgotten lingered like smoke that refused to dissipate. Thus, Yongtai's tomb, neglected and uncelebrated, became a symbol of how power erases as much as it kills. She was transformed into a shadow, not only in her own lifetime, but in the chronicles of her dynasty. A ghost in every sense, unseen, unspoken, but still haunting. Her forgotten burial marked the depth of her tragedy, not only to lose her life, but to lose her place in history. For a time, Princess Yongtai ceased to exist in the memory of her own empire, her youth consumed by silence, as merciless as the soil that covered her. Time, however, has a way of reopening graves, not to undo the past, but to force the living to confront what was buried. After Wu Zetian's death in 705, the Tang dynasty was restored under Emperor Zhongzong, and with it came a reckoning with the silences left behind. Among those silences was the injustice inflicted upon Princess Yongtai. For years, she had been treated as though she had never existed, her name erased from official remembrance, her tomb stripped of honor. But with Wu Zetian gone, there was space to redress, however imperfectly, what had been done. The court could not restore her life, but it could restore her dignity. Yongtai was posthumously rehabilitated. Titles were granted to her, her place among the Tang princesses reinstated. A new tomb was commissioned, one that reflected her true station as the granddaughter of emperors. The restoration was not merely personal, it was political. By honoring her, the restored Tang court distanced itself from the cruelty of Wu Zetian's rule, signaling to the empire that legitimacy had returned, and with it, respect for tradition and family. The new tomb was no ordinary resting place. Constructed on a grand scale, it became a monument to both her tragedy and her regained honor. Walls were painted with brilliant murals, processions of court ladies in flowing robes, musicians playing flutes and lutes, horses prancing in elegant stride. The imagery captured the vibrant life of the Tang court, a world Yongtai had once inhabited but been denied by premature death. For those who entered the tomb centuries later, the murals were hauntingly beautiful. They did not depict her burial, her suffering, or her silencing. Instead, they preserved the vision of a princess as she might have lived, surrounded by music, beauty, and refinement. The murals became a kind of resistance against the cruelty of her fate, insisting that she be remembered not as a victim, but as a figure of elegance and promise. Yet, even in restoration, the tragedy remained. Posthumous honors are, by their nature, too late. They soothe the living more than they heal the dead. For Yongtai, the recognition came years after her voice had been stilled, after her body had been smothered by earth. The pomp of her rebuilt tomb could not replace the 17 years stolen from her, nor erase the suffocating darkness of her final moments. Her rehabilitation also carried irony. The same dynasty that had allowed her to be silenced now claimed to honor her. The same system that had buried her alive now sought legitimacy by raising her name. In this, Yongtai's story reveals the double edge of politics. Memory itself becomes a tool, manipulated as ruthlessly as life and death. Still, there is something deeply human in the act of rebuilding her tomb, of painting walls with music and beauty, of carving her name once more into stone. It suggests that even within the machinery of power, conscience stirs. That even an empire that had tried to erase her could not wholly resist the pull of grief and guilt. Thus, Princess Yongtai's memory was brought back into the light. her tomb transformed into a silent but eloquent testimony. She was restored to history, not in time to save her, but enough to ensure that her silence would no longer be absolute. Centuries after her death, the silence surrounding Princess Yongtai was disturbed once again, not by politics, but by archaeology. In the 20th century, her tomb was excavated, and what emerged from the soil was a revelation. The princess, who had been buried alive, denied dignity in death, had nonetheless been surrounded by beauty in her eternal rest. The tomb, located near Qiangxian in Shanxi province, opened like a time capsule from the Tang dynasty. Long, sloping passageways led down into chambers where the past still lingered in color and form. On the walls stretched murals of astonishing vitality. Paintings of court ladies in flowing robes, their faces delicate, their gestures poised with elegance. Musicians held lutes, flutes, and drums. Dancers seemed caught in mid-motion, their sleeves unfurling like petals in the wind. Birds, horses, and mythical beasts filled the spaces, weaving a vision of the world Yongtai had once inhabited. To step inside the tomb was to feel her presence not as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had been entwined with art, music, and ritual. The irony was profound. Her death had been an erasure, yet her tomb became a gallery of memory more vivid than any chronicle. The murals spoke volumes about Tang culture. They showed us the fashions of noblewomen, their towering hairstyles, their silken robes dyed in shades of red, blue, and gold. They revealed the instruments of music that filled the court, the games and pastimes of the elite, even the animals that symbolized power and beauty. Through Yongtai's tomb, the daily life of the Tang elite was preserved with stunning intimacy, offering a window into an age both glorious and fragile. And yet, amid the splendor, the tragedy lingered. Each painted face on the walls seemed to carry an unspoken question. Why had such a vibrant world cast its own children into the ground so mercilessly? The beauty of the murals contrasted painfully with the brutality of her fate. The princess who should have lived among these courtly scenes was instead their silent companion for eternity. The discovery of her tomb did more than restore her memory. It forced history to confront her. No longer could she be dismissed as a forgotten casualty of palace intrigue. The murals, the artifacts, the sheer scale of the tomb all testified that she had mattered, that her life had once shone brightly enough to be honored, even after betrayal. For modern observers, the tomb of Princess Yongtai stands as both a treasure and a wound. It is a treasure because it preserves the Tang dynasty at its height, revealing details no text could fully capture. But it is also a wound because it reminds us that behind every artifact lies a human story, often scarred by suffering. Thus, Yongtai's tomb became more than an archaeological site. It became a silent courtroom, where the murals testified against the cruelty of her death. Each brushstroke whispered her name back into history, ensuring that she would not remain buried in silence forever. Princess Yongtai's story ends not with triumph, but with echo. She was only 17 when suspicion smothered her, when earth pressed down upon her final breath. Her death was not the result of rebellion, nor of betrayal, but of the machinery of absolute power that devours its own blood to sustain itself. Her tragedy is the tragedy of youth itself, extinguished before it could bloom. At 17, she should have been writing poetry beneath lantern light, dreaming of marriage, or walking through the gardens of Chang'an in spring. Instead, she was silenced by the soil, transformed into a symbol of how fragile life becomes under suspicion. Her youth was buried, her laughter stilled, her promise consumed by politics. And yet, in death, she speaks. The silence forced upon her during her life has become a haunting voice across the centuries. Her tomb, with its murals of dancers and musicians, insists that she be remembered not only as a victim, but as a living part of Tang brilliance. Her fate reminds us that history is not only written by victors, but also whispered by the silenced. The story of Yongtai also forces us to look at power itself. Wu Zetian's reign was remarkable, a testament to ambition and ability, but it was built on fear. In silencing her granddaughter, she revealed the darkest paradox of absolute authority, that it cannot coexist with love, that it sacrifices family for survival, that it destroys the very future it seeks to control. Yongtai's death was not an isolated act. It was the embodiment of a system where no bond, no innocence, no youth was sacred. To reflect on her death is to reflect on how power consumes. It feeds not only on enemies, but on kin, on those closest to the throne. It transforms beauty into threat, talent into crime, blood into liability. The soil that smothered Yongtai was more than earth. It was the weight of power crushing the fragile body of youth. Yet her memory endures. Modern eyes that gaze upon her tomb's murals see not only the splendor of Tang culture, but also the shadow it cast. They see the young woman buried alive, denied voice, denied future, but restored in art. They see a cautionary tale, that when authority is unchecked, even the most radiant lives can vanish in silence. In the end, Yongtai's legacy is not her erasure, but her persistence. She remains a reminder that silence itself can become a voice, that the forgotten can return through memory, that injustice, no matter how carefully buried, will one day resurface. Herbie Keach is eternal, a 17-year-old girl buried alive, silenced by her own blood, remembered by history not for rebellion, but for innocence lost. And in that silence, we hear the faintest echo of her final breath, a whisper that continues to haunt the corridors of time.